So my text today comes from that poem from Thomas Robertson, a poem that's actually called The Great Realization. As we saw earlier, it's a bedtime story, the one about the virus. Many of you have likely already seen it. Anybody seen that before? A couple of you? For those keeping track, this video has been played over 7 million times. It was released in April of last year, mere months into that first wave of lockdowns. And as those initial weeks dragged into months and now into years, I've kept returning to that little 4-minute window of sunshine to remind myself that even facing unfathomable things, people are resilient and sweet and hopeful. Even today, this message is still like cool water to me, a summer breeze, a promise. It's helped, which is why it's been in my back pocket ever since. And I'm sharing it with you today for a particular reason. Because today, despite our best efforts, the pandemic is not over. To all reports, we still have many months to go before there will be vaccines available for all. We're getting there, but not there yet. And I know that's not awesome news. So we're going to still need to be cautious for a while. But at some point, whether it's 10 years or 20, 100, or even more, the story of this time, the story of how we responded, will be told. And while this story didn't exactly start with the pandemic, right? Maybe 2020 was the year where things changed. And so this morning, let's imagine that some future us, or maybe it's our grandkids or great-grandkids or somebody we know down the block, someone's going to look back to 2020. And maybe they will say, this is how it started. This is a good time to do our thing. So I'm going to invite the tech team to remove the Zoom spotlight for our online friends. And what I want them to do is hit that button in the upper right-hand corner, the one that says View, and I want you to pull that down until it says Gallery. And you'll know it's right because there will be a billion little boxes that pop up for all of the online viewers. And if you are online, this is a great time to turn on that camera. Now, we'll look at all of our friends and community here in the sanctuary. And in the spirit of our friend, the Reverend Dr. Otis Moss III of Trinity Church here in Chicago, I want you now to turn to a neighbor. Turn to a neighbor, any neighbor. I can totally see you. That's right, just turn to a neighbor and say, in your indoor voices, neighbor, oh neighbor, this is how it started. Well done. Amen. This morning, I'm going to ask you to imagine that you are a high school teacher 100 years from now, right? 100 years from now, high school teacher. Some of you are looking like, what? High school teacher? No, I would never. Okay, it's fine. But just imagine you're talking to your class about the early part of the 21st century, and you're recounting some of the highlights of that admittedly very troubled time. You talk about 9/11 and the so-called war on terror. You talk about global climate change. You talk about the virus. What do you say to them? What do you wish you could say to them? What would you wish that we today would have done so that you then would have something, anything, to say to them? kind of a fun exercise, right? Many of you have no doubt done stuff like this before, thinking about today from the perspective of some time in the future. Maybe using that 7-generation model. 3 generations back, 3 generations forward. We've talked about that before, but using that kind of thinking today as a lure, a reason, a motivation for making changes now. So play along. What would you say? I'm going to guess that many of us here today would not be terribly optimistic, especially if you're thinking about global climate change, or the rise in global authoritarianism, or the seemingly intractable American partisanship. There are many indications that things are heading off a cliff, and that any conversations with a teenager 100 years from now will likely be around a small fire in the middle of the ruins of human civilization. Look, I get it. It's tempting, right? It's tempting to look at the news and think of the future in these contexts, this darkness. To you, I want to recall 3 things, kind of help frame that approach, maybe reframe it. 1, Nostradamus was full of crap. 2, 100 years is a really long time. 100 years ago, we didn't have penicillin. 3, innovation under pressure. It's kind of our whole gig. That's what we do. What these 3 things tell me to do is take a breath and have a little faith, and then get to work. So to embrace possibility as our monthly theme, which it is, we're going to have to save the dystopian futures and bleak hellscapes for a future sermon. Please mark your calendars. This morning, though, I want to acknowledge that the future is simply not going to be like the past. If there's one thing history has shown us, it is that change is part of living, of being a human organism, living amongst a vast, interconnected web of life, suspended, however briefly, on the arc of time and space. Writer Octavia Butler, the author of one of my most quoted novels, Parable of the Sower, she goes so far as to identify change as the fundamental truth of existence. Change cannot be avoided. Change cannot be overcome. Change is the one fact that binds everything together. All that is, was, and forever will be shares this one trait. It, whatever it is, will change. Change is the ongoing revelation, the continuing story of creation, the unfolding of mystery, and the act itself, the fact itself, is holy. For Butler, change is the ultimate, the ground of being. We could say that change is God. She did. Change is God. God is change. It's a bit radical, sure. But the question is, what do we do with that? Whatever the future may look like, it will not look like today. There is literally no way to know what tomorrow holds because the future is what we're creating today. The decisions we make today, the changes we make, they matter. Some matter a little. Some matter a lot. But the future, the sum of change, the future is not yet. And that is important. Why? Because the story of our lives, the story of our species and our planet is something we still, you and I, still have at least some impact on. We human beings are given a choice. We can either be hit by change, like it's some kind of cosmic bus, or we can seize it. As Butler says, we can shape it. Butler's books are fantastic, and I cannot commend them enough. But what I want to turn to now are some of the things that we've learned about change this past year, the year that's kind of unfolded right on top of us, willy or nilly. One of the things we've learned is that we don't have to do something just because we've always done it that way. This one is pretty obvious, right? If you have joined us here at UUSG at any point in the last year and a half, you did that remotely. Being on Zoom was not the same as being in person. Sure, it wasn't, but it was something. It was where together we laughed at absurdity. We railed against injustice. We shared our hopes and fears, our pains, and our unexpected moments of joy. We came together and did what we could, what we needed, because what we needed was each other. I was talking with my wife, Julia, whom some of you met this summer. And as you probably remember, Julia was a PhD student in government. And this week she was telling me about a transformation that she's been thinking about. One that's not been captured in the news. One that over the last couple of years has really only been reported on anecdotally. And it's this. Communities have started reorganizing themselves. What activists found in the last 2 election cycles is that in times of pressure, and from 2016 to 2020, we faced a lot of pressure. Many of our most vulnerable were able to lean into their communities for resources like food, daycare, rides, connection, and more. And it was this community support that carried those communities through the economic downturn, at least in part. But it was precisely this kind of support that led to breakout Democrat turnout. But that's not all. You've heard, I'm sure, the complaint that, quote, there is a labor shortage. Anybody heard that one in the news? There is a labor shortage. It's been on CNN, USA Today, Fox News. Pundits have many explanations for these, quote, missing workers. From laziness to blaming, quote, all the free money that the government has been giving away. In a rather sharp rebuke, a recent article appeared in the Globe and Mail, a Canadian newspaper, and in that article, service worker Lori Fox noted that 2/3 of restaurant workers lost their jobs during the pandemic. The reason many of them haven't come back is due, at least in part, to, quote, an abysmally low rate of pay, bad, often erratic hours, no sick days, and near constant sexual harassment, racism, sexism, and queer phobia. Remember, this is Canada, so healthcare doesn't need to be added to the top of that pile. It seems, perhaps, that the so-called labor shortage is self-inflicted, at least in part. During the pandemic, many of those frontline workers, those essential service people, once they found themselves unable to work, did other things. Some found hobbies. Some found other work. Many of them woke up. They, like Fox, refused to, quote, simply accept the old conditions. Recently, Philip Kane, a transportation company exec, wrote an article for Inc. magazine titled The Great Resignation. In that article, he echoes what Lori Fox described. He says, quote, according to the U.S. Department of Labor, during the 3 months of April, May, and June of 2021, this year, a total of 11.5 million workers quit their jobs. A survey of over 30,000 workers found that 41% are considering quitting. That number jumps to 54% when Gen Z is considered alone. Gallup found that 48% of employees are actively searching for new opportunities, and 38% plan to make a change in the next 6 months. Kane calls this alarming. He continues. According to a recent survey by LinkedIn, 74% of those surveyed found that the time spent at home, either during the shutdowns or working remotely during the pandemic, had caused them to rethink their current work situation. A great many, over half in several surveys, cite stress and burnout in their current position as a reason for looking elsewhere. Others point to dissatisfaction, even fear, caused by knee-jerk cost-cutting actions by their current employer, with many finding fundamental unfairness in holds on promotions, frozen merit increases, and indiscriminate layoffs as they watched executive leadership refuse to participate in the pain. Many have simply had it with being undervalued and unheard by toxic, narcissistic managers. Finally, fully a third stated concerns with their personal safety and having to return to an on-site position while the pandemic still rages. Big business doesn't care about workers. I'm shocked. But what seems very different here is that folks from all walks of life, even and especially perhaps the young, and those many of us here today would call those, quote, lacking privilege, they are not just saying, as we might have said, they're not just saying, oh well. No, they're saying no. No to life as they knew it. No to life as their parents knew it. No to the corporate grind. No to what Karl Marx would have called alienated labor. Instead, they're saying yes. Yes to connection. Yes to community. Yes to mutual aid, to engaging with the world around them, to helping each other claim better outcomes, better jobs, better lives. They're leaning on each other, and perhaps because of that support, they are saying yes to change. It's too soon to say if this will be the moral of the story that we get to tell our students of tomorrow. What it is, however, is exciting. And I have to ask, what if this was the time we woke up, said enough is enough, and said yes to change? What if this was the time that instead of letting change happen to us, we chose to happen to change? What if this is how it all started? I'll keep looking, and I'm sure you'll do the same, but we don't have to look far or that hard. We can see signs of change here on our own walls. We can see them on the other side of our cameras. We see them in labor shortages. We see them in new infrastructure bills. We see them in new climate change bills, in the For the People Act, and for other public demands for voting rights, women's rights, health care, for care, for change. And we also see it in the reaction, the reactivity, the rejection of those who deny change, who fear change, who say no to the face of God looming at them out of the slow march of human history. I don't know what the future holds. 2020 may not be the year it all started, but as today's text urges us to consider is that it could be. 2020 could be a beginning. 2020 was that year, though, remember? It was the year we were forced to stop, to examine, to evaluate. Maybe it will also be our great realization, the time we located ourselves on the arc of the moral universe and decided together to bend it toward a different ending, to shape the change to come. And that's why we're here, after all. because we are better when we are together. We dream bigger when we dream together. We are seekers after truth and goodness, after all. And perhaps that, in the end, is what will tell our future students of history. That we were here, that we lived, that we struggled, that we learned. And then we chose to do it different. For now, I'll close with this. But why did it take us so long to bring the people back together? Well, sometimes you have to get sick, my boy, before you start feeling better. Now lie down and dream of tomorrow and all the things that we can do. And who knows, if you dream hard enough, maybe some of them will come true. We now call it the Great Realization. And yes, since then, there have been many. But that's the story of how it all started and why hindsight is 20/20. Amen. Welcome back, UUSG. Welcome home. And as we prepare to leave this place, continue your journey in love. Care for one another and care for this, our earth. Do justice and make peace. And as you go, know that whatever taste or touch you've had in this time and place of hope, joy, love, or peace, that goes with you out into the world. We are different for having spent this time together. So remember, live boldly and with thanksgiving.